The sports car, a symbol of youth, freedom, vitality. It has three potent qualities: good looks, superb engineering, and power. The traditional sports car looked at home on the open road, but felt as if it ought to be on the racetrack. Today, racing sports cars can be driven only on the racetrack at speeds of over 200 miles an hour. Here, the task is to win the race and attract the attention of potential sports car buyers. Today, the track has become an extension of the showroom.
Sports car racing in the old days, I know in Ireland, it was a case of the racing was secondary to what you did in the pub afterwards. You know, first man onto the stool to have a pint in his hand won the race. But now it's high tech. Now we have major manufacturers who want to make statements about their company, their cars, their machinery, and they do that by being successful on the racetrack. This track here is very tight, it's demanding, grueling, bumpy. I mean, all the adjectives you could use describes this place perfectly. On top of that, it's very hot here.
I look at these race cars, and every time I get into one, it's the finest that technology can build. It's like, an Air Force jet or the space shuttle or something to that nature. It's just a thing of the future.
You come in and you're just fighting for your life and you're terrified, and you have the death grip on the wheel. They ask you something like, what's the water temperature? I says, don't ask me, you don't think I have time to look, do you? You know. So here it is very, very difficult. You're always in a turn. I mean, no kidding. You're never not turning the wheel. And that alone makes it very difficult. No time whatsoever to relax.
And away they go on the 4-mile course that encircles potato fields and plush country estates.
40 years ago, people raced sports cars for fun. Sports car owners drove to the meeting, competed, and if the car was still in one piece, drove home again. MGs originated in the 1920s, the brainchild of Cecil Kimber. He managed to create the right mixture of image and performance. Because they were also driven on ordinary roads, they had to have mudguards, lights, and traffic indicators. People who bought them were buying more than a means of transport. They were saying something about themselves. They belonged to an exclusive club. Many racing drivers had their first taste of competition in an MG.
I was a great admirer of the MG Marque as a youth because of this sort of team involvement that they had, this little tiny company, and the neat-looking little cars, single overhead cam inline sixes, supercharged to a high degree and getting enormous outputs per unit capacity, more so than the auto unions and the Mercedes were doing in the late 30s, which few people know. Today, when you say MG, people think of that funny little sports car that is around and they're just sort of, nothing. But to me, I was intrigued as anything as to how they managed. That was what sort of bent me over toward the European road racing type of thing.
European manufacturers had a tradition of building elegant sports cars, and after the war, there was a hunger for distinctive cars. Jaguar moved into this market in 1948 with the XK120. It was a road car with racing potential, capable of 132 miles an hour. To improve their image, Jaguar decided to go racing.
The whole thing was done on the basis of we are not motor racing for fun, we are motor racing to make the name of Jaguar. And which race will give us the maximum publicity? And the answer was Le Mans 24 Hours.
The world's finest sports cars and drivers begin the grueling 24-hour grind at Le Mans. That is the premier race of them all.
Le Mans is more than just a motor race. It's a whole weekend of entertainment, a festival of speed and endurance, a celebration and a shop window for the sports car. Each year, hundreds of thousands of people make the pilgrimage to one of the most hallowed places in motor racing.
To see an old French city with men wearing blue coveralls and carrying bread under their arms on their bicycles with a little cigarette hanging out of their mouth, it was just an enormous cultural shock, I guess, for me. And our hotel was right next to the railroad station, and there were these strange machines with steam making coffee, and the whole thing was like a different world.
The historic circuit has been used since the 1920s. Generations of drivers have learnt the famous corners, Arnage, the S's, Tête Rouge. A link with the past is the Mulsanne Strait, a public road closed each year for the race.
There were 2 or 3 corners which were tricky, and you used all the roads, so it was quite challenging. It wasn't a fatiguing circuit, because you've got the Mulsanne Strait where you could sit back and let it, you know, have its head. The burning thing in my life had been to drive at Le Mans. Unlike many of the Grand Prix drivers, I actually liked it. I enjoyed getting in a car and just driving and driving, you know, going on and on and on. To me, that was fun.
And it still goes on, day and night.
I love the night driving at Le Mans. It's very, very exhilarating. Not so much now we've got these stupid new chicanes they put in, but certainly on the old straight, it was wonderful to go down that straight at 230 and you just look up and see the stars and everything. It was wonderful. You know, you can't explain it to people that it can be romantic driving 230 miles an hour. Most people think it's a white-knuckle ride. You're looking so far ahead out the windscreen that the sky meets your horizon, so you're just looking out and you can see the stars just like that. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful experience.
It wasn't so wonderful in an open car when it rained.
I'd already done several wet runs, and at 3 o'clock in the morning I'd run out of sort of dry socks, dry pants, dry vests, etc., and I had to pull on, you know, wet vests, you know, wet socks, wet underpants at 3 o'clock in the morning and go out and drive a motor car in a race that I really wasn't interested in. And I thought, well, if I ever do this again, I really need to be certified, and I didn't drive again.
Jaguar took the XK120 to Le Mans in 1950, but they could manage only 12th and 15th places. For 1951, they built a new car, the C-Type, specially for the race. Jaguar knew they had the potential to win.
We realized that none of our competitors had a modern motor car. Nobody had a really up-to-date motor car. Nobody had an aerodynamically shaped motor car. And we reckon if we just produced a lighter motor car with an aerodynamic shape using our virtually standard engine gearbox axle units, we had a chance of winning the next year.
The C-Type won in 1951. In 1953, Jaguar were among the first to fit disc brakes.
At Le Mans, any car with drum brakes must nurse the brakes to get to the end. And the Jaguars could afford to brake at the last moment, from the beginning to the end of the race.
The C-types came first, second and third. In 1952, Mercedes came into sports car racing with the now legendary 300 SL. It made an instant impact on the racetrack. Mercedes went on to make a huge investment in racing. Under their equally legendary manager Alfred Neubauer, they were always the team which others had to try very hard to beat. Their engineering excellence was renowned, so was their organization. With the best drivers, they became formidable opponents.
Mercedes were, in my mind, certainly in my era, the greatest team in the world. They have the name, they have the history, they have the cars, they have the mechanics. I drove for Mercedes in 1955, and having finished the year, I rather felt if I'd said to them, I'd like square wheels, because I think it might work, Neubauer would go to a big book this thick, go through it, and he'd say, well, wait a minute, we tried this in 1926, and the bastard thing vibrated. Or the next day they'd be fitted. Because I had things on that car. I remember once I was at Monza on the banking, and a stone hit my windscreen, which was only this big, very small, but you could not drive without it. The wind pressure at Monza was enormous. I mean, you're doing 160, 170 around the banking. And the first the mechanics knew was I came into the pits pointing, no windscreen, which is not an easy thing to see anyway, because they weren't big windscreens. 37 seconds later, I think, I went out with a new windscreen fitted. That's fairly impressive. More impressive is the next race, if the windscreen broke, and I pushed a button, another windscreen came up.
When Jaguar and Mercedes arrived for the 1955 Le Mans, both had prepared their latest cars for a fight to the finish. There was little to choose in power and top speed between Jaguar's D-Type and the Mercedes 300 SLR. Both had staying power. The race would be decided by the drivers. The Mercedes team included Fangio, Moss and the French driver Pierre Levègue. Jaguar's hopes were pinned on Mike Hawthorn.
Hawthorn, on his day, was, in my opinion, the fastest driver we have had in Britain since the war. Fabulous bloke, great fellow. And his arch rival, Fangio, and they were great friends, by the way, was the leading driver in the Mercedes. And these two got into the great battle.
First away is Castellotti in his Ferrari, closely followed by a Jaguar.
1955 was a fateful year. Le Mans is run with different classes of cars at the same time. Fangio and Hawthorn were in the fastest group, and as they battled it out, they had to pass less powerful cars. At 6:30 in the evening, Hawthorn, approaching the pit straight, was about to overtake one of the slower cars, an Austin Healey driven by Lance Macklin.
Hawthorn was coming up, passing him, coming in on a perfectly correct line to the pits. Behind him was Levègue, driving the 300 SLR Mercedes, and right behind him Fangio, about to pass him.
First car to come by was Hawthorn. And I was rather pleased to see this because I realised he was now in the lead. And he went past and he pulled across in front of me. And then, to my amazement, his brake lights came on. And I thought, well, what the hell is he doing that for?
He sees the Jaguar right in front of him braking. And he swerved to the left to avoid it. Levègue, who came behind, was surprised and couldn't apparently do anything about it.
And then suddenly there's an almighty bang. And Levègue's car came so right over the top of me. His wheel came right past my left ear. I could feel the heat of his exhaust as he went by so close.
Levègue's Mercedes had touched Macklin's car. It hit the barriers and caught fire. Levègue was killed. Parts of the car were flung into the crowd.
The next thing I knew, all this racket and all this tin work and junk and noise and racket and crashing cars and everything was happening, and people were flooding into our pit from the track side, trying to get out our back door, which was locked. You know, because we never knew how far it was going to go, because it was right across from us, in down, maybe 20, 30 yards, something like that.
Over 80 spectators were killed. It was the worst accident in motor racing history.
I think it's just got to be assumed, and which was eventually decided, that it was something which could happen, but you couldn't really place the blame on anyone in particular. It was just a combination of circumstances which would probably never happen again, hopefully never will.
The race continued, though without Mercedes, who withdrew as a mark of respect for the dead. They pulled out of racing at the end of the season. Hawthorn went on to win a sad and hollow victory for Jaguar. For the next 2 years, the Jaguars were unbeatable at Le Mans. Every victory enhanced their reputation worldwide.
The big British racers continue a phenomenal streak of victories in every major sports car race, placing 1, 2, 3, 4 at Le Mans. The winner's average speed for the route, 114 miles an hour. Over 2,500-mile course, that's traveling.
The pattern at Le Mans has been for one company to rise to the top for a few years, only to have its place taken by a new challenger willing to make the investment in racing. Ferrari won Le Mans twice in the 1950s, but they were behind other manufacturers in braking and aerodynamics. But in 1960, it was Ferrari's turn to shine with the Testarossa, driven by Paul Frère.
When Olivier, Jean-Lebien and I won Le Mans with a Ferrari in 1960, that was a year when the regulations specified that the windscreen must be 25 centimeters high. So they had just one large windscreen with no attempt whatsoever at improving aerodynamics. And I found the car so slow on the straight that I took out my stopwatch and timed myself along the straight.
Diplomatically, Paul Frère suggested to Enzo Ferrari that his designs were old-fashioned.
And his very typical answer was that, well, you know, aerodynamics are for people who can't make proper engines.
Nonetheless, Ferrari's cars went on winning at Le Mans.
This is an American entry, driven by Maston Gregory of Kansas City and Jochen Rindt of Austria. Despite its New York ownership, it's an Italian Ferrari, and when it crosses the finish, it makes the 6th year in a row that a Ferrari has won. An American victory in a French race with an Italian car.
The challenge to Ferrari came from Ford. The car was the GT40. Ferraris had not only been winning at Le Mans, they'd been winning regularly in America too. Henry Ford III was jealous of Italian success on his home ground. Ford were moving into racing to promote their image.
In the heady days of the 60s, it seemed a very good idea, and indeed it was, because it brought an enormous amount of excitement to the cars. And it opened doors into handling and ride and technical development and disc brakes and all sorts of things come along which might not otherwise have come.
Ford first tried to buy Ferrari. It wasn't just a matter of money. There was a clash of cultures, and the bid failed.
It was like trying to mix popcorn and pasta. I don't think it was a very nourishing recipe. And in the end, it was decided not to do it, but to go back and do the GT40 ourselves.
At Le Mans in 1966, GT40s came first, second and third. After spending $150 million, popcorn had triumphed over pasta.
We were doing 209 miles an hour down the Mulsanne Straight then. And even today, I mean, in the race, I don't think they do much over 230. The car itself, handling-wise, was, very, very, very good. It was a neutral handling car. Again, it was a car that you could get a bit of oversteer if you needed it. It was progressive and controllable, and altogether just a very, very, very good car. It should have won at Le Mans long before it did.
GT40s won Le Mans 4 times in a row and repaid the investment. Then they too were eclipsed. The name which replaced Ford on the winner's rostrum at Le Mans was to become the most successful of them all, Porsche. This humble 356 was the first car to bear the family name. It came out in 1948. In the development of Porsche cars, racing has always been crucial. They took part in all the great sports car races, the Targa Florio, Daytona, Sebring. By 1970, they'd made 17 attempts to gain the greatest prize, an outright win at Le Mans. The 1970 Le Mans saw the beginning of a new era. Porsche's persistence was beginning to pay off. Their car that year was a much improved 917.
I think the Porsche 917 is just the most outrageous car. It's a wonderful tribute to them that you can, drivers don't consider anything ever breaking. You just thunder down the Mulsanne straight at 235, never think that anything's going to break. To me, that car had real personality.
The 917 was just the start of a string of successes in the 1970s. By 1982, they were dominant. The key was their reliability.
We got into the race, it ran absolutely faultlessly the whole race, didn't even have to lift the bodywork up to check in the back. And we won the race, and that was it.
Another 6 victories followed, an unrivaled record. The Porsche name had come a long way since its controversial beginning. Professor Ferry Porsche has spent his life designing, improving, and marketing his family of sports cars. He learned his engineering from his father.
Ich bin schon ab 5-6 Jahren.
From the age of 5-6 years, I would go every Saturday, Sunday, weekends to the factory with my father and would listen to the conversations he had with his people.
His father, Dr. Ferdinand Porsche, designed the pre-war auto unions, successful Grand Prix cars, which he called his locomotives. The hallmark of the early Porsche design, like the 1934 prototype NSU, was the engine at the back. This idea was developed by Ferdinand Porsche into what became the most successful car ever, the Volkswagen. The people's car was a triumph of concept, design and image. It was irresistible to Adolf Hitler, but after the war the Porsche family suffered for their association with the Nazi war machine.
Die Franzosen wollten das Volkswagenwerk als Reparations.
The French wanted the Volkswagen factory as reparation payment and were negotiating this with the other allies. And they thought it would be best if they brought us in to set it up for them. And when the French car industry got wind of this, they found ways and means, so to speak, to have us locked up as war criminals.
Father and son spent time in prison, where Ferry Porsche planned how to restart the family business.
Was sollte ich Besseres tun als mein Hobby?
So what would be better for me to do than to translate my hobby into reality with my father's workforce? And it was done simply, you see, with such components as we had available. That meant, of course, many Volkswagen parts. To produce a very lightweight vehicle, which could be driven faster than the big locomotives, as I always say, and which was really fun to drive.
So ein Auto zu fahren.
Early Porsches were fun and they were fast. They quickly became the backbone of Ferry Porsche's strategy for selling his cars.
I had a very simple formula. A page of advertising costs a certain amount, and If I have a sporting success, then I get that page for nothing, and that page gets read.
For a company, the only thing worth investing in is winning. The price of winning today is the cost of beating established companies like Porsche, where the quest for technical improvement is constant and meticulous. Unlike the aesthetically pleasing cars of half a century ago, the shape of today's racing Porsche is no longer determined by fashion, but by function. That function is performance, 0 to 150 in 10 seconds, braking from 180 to 0 in 5 seconds. Achieving that performance is staggeringly expensive. It's a price any company serious about selling sports cars must pay. It has to buy its reputation and its image.
We can see with the Japanese the massive investment they're putting in, whether it's in Formula One with Honda or Group C with Nissan, both in Europe and here, and Toyota. They're buying their heritage. The wins that Jaguar had at Le Mans in the 50s, it all stands you in good stead in the future. I mean, not to belabor the point, but I think the management that is prepared to back a successful racing program are the same aggressive management that is going to make a road car as good as it possibly can be.
Without the commercial link between racing and production cars, the hugely expensive business of racing would not survive.
20 years ago, I think there was a huge amount that went from race cars to production cars. 10 years ago, quite a bit went from race cars to production cars. Now, we're actually taking pieces from some of our production cars and adapting them to the race cars, and this is absolute true.
It's a very serious business. I mean, they wouldn't be in it unless it was linked directly to car sales. And the Japanese factories, the Jaguar factories, it's, I think, great racing. In fact, technically, there's more scope for innovation and new ideas than there is in the Indy cars or even Formula One.
As long as there's a market for glamorous cars, manufacturers will build them. And once they've built them, they'll always have to prove themselves by racing.